Now we can finally talk about execution context. .NET uses the execution context for us anytime we use async await to essentially attach information to a task that is specific to the thread we're working on, like security context, like we talked about in the previous video around iPrincipal, the synchronization context, which we'll talk about in the next video, which is how we can return back to the calling thread or to the UI thread if we need to navigate all the way back to the UI thread, as well as culture information. For example, what language is the user using so that we can respond properly in a language that they'll understand. This execution context is attached to the task and it's loaded to the thread before execution. Now, it is immutable. It cannot be changed once it's set, which is good because we don't want .NET to accidentally override our execution context. And if we want to, and I don't recommend this, but we can actually suppress the flow of the execution context. So perhaps we have an app that has very sensitive information that we never want to pass between threads. We can say execution context.suppress flow, and that tells .NET, hey, I don't want to pass the execution context to any new thread. Any information that's specific to this thread needs to stay on this thread. And if we want to resume or restore the flow of the execution context, we can always call execution context.restore flow. Now, let's jump into the code and look at an example about how this works in .NET. Here, I've created a console app that plays around with the various aspects of execution context. Now, as we mentioned in the slides, the execution context is what allows async await to pass information about the current state of our program between threads. So certain information like the current culture info, our current principal, and then even certain types like this async local type will pass along its value from thread to thread using async await thanks to the execution context. So what we have here is a program that essentially plays around with that information. We're going to change the current culture, we're going to change the principal, we're going to play around with this value of this async local type of string. And I have an example here that shows how we can also run into problems if we make assumptions about the execution context or if we suppress the flow of the execution context. But let's jump into it. I have some breakpoints set up in the code. So let's go ahead and run the debugger, and I'll pause at each breakpoint to explain what the code's done along the way. Okay, so we've hit our first breakpoint, and what we've done so far is we've assigned random values to our culture info, to our current principal, and to async local data, and we're about to print them to the screen. So I have a method down here called print thread values, and it prints the current thread ID, the current culture's display name, the current principal, and whatever we have assigned to the value of async local data. So when we run this line, print thread values, what we should see is that we're on the main thread, thread 1, that our culture info is Spanish for specifically Spain, that we are using a claims principal for our current principal, and our async local data value is initial value. So let's step over this and let's show our console output. Perfect. So we printed to the console that the main thread starts, and then we've printed all of the information about our current thread. And again, this information is passed along when we use async await from thread to thread. So what I'm going to do here in this next line of code, I'm going to capture our current execution context, because what we're going to do is we're going to spin up a new thread. So we're no longer on the main thread. We're no longer on thread 1 inside of here. And inside of here, we're going to change everything. We're going to change the current culture to be English, specifically UK English. We're going to use a custom principal that I've created called a DOM train principal, and we'll reassign the async local data value to be async local data in this thread. But again, remember, before we jumped into the thread, I captured the main thread's execution context. So let me go ahead and catch up to this breakpoint here. There we go. So we've caught up to this breakpoint. We're about to print the values. And what do we think we'll get? Well, we literally just assigned all these values here inside of this background thread. So I would imagine that we'll see English UK, we'll see a DOM train principal, and we'll see async local data in the thread. So let's go ahead and step over this method so it can execute. Let's look at the results here. So here was our initial results from the main thread, and here is our background thread after we assigned all those values. And it's exactly what we expected. We see that we've reassigned the culture to be English United Kingdom, that we're now using a different principal, our DOM train principal, and our async local data value is specifically saying that it was set in this thread. We're on a background thread, we're on thread 7, but what we're about to do now is we're going to call execution context.run and essentially run the same code. So all this method's going to do is print thread values again with the header right before it does it to let us know here in the console that this is the same background thread, but now we're using main thread's execution context. So again, what we've done is we've captured the main thread execution context back here while we were still on the main thread. And when we call execution context.run, we can actually see here in IntelliSense, let's see if I can get this to pop up. There we go. So execution context.run, it runs a method in a specified execution context on the current thread. So this code here is still going to run on thread 7, but because we're passing in that execution context that we captured up here, where we had set all these values on the main thread, like the current culture to be Spanish Spain, that the current principal is a claims principal, and that the async local data value is initial value. Now, this code is going to run, this print thread values is going to run, but using the main thread's execution context. So let's allow this code to run and see what shows up in our console. So we see here, we're on the same background thread, thread ID 7, thread ID 7. This is the same thread that we created by saying new thread, but all these values that we set inside the thread, like the current culture, the current principal, the async local data, those have all reverted back to the same values of the main thread. And that's because we called execution context.run and specifically passed in that main thread execution context that we captured before spinning up this thread. So this main thread execution context retains all the information about its culture and its principal, which again is Spanish Spain, system security.claims principal, initial value. And here for execution context.run, when we print these thread values again, but this time using the main thread's execution context, we see that yes, we're still on that same background thread, but now our culture has reverted back to the main thread's culture of Spanish Spain. And we're back on our claims principal and we're back in our initial value here. And so what we're seeing here is that as long as the execution context is passed along, the information supplied by it, the current culture, the current principal, all the async local data, all of that data that's referenced and flowed via the execution context is restored here. Okay, let's continue this program because we're not done yet. What I want to show now is that we're back on the main thread. So the code here that just jumped was after we initialized this thread. So we initialize the thread, and then we have to manually start the thread and manually wait for the thread to complete. But now we know we're back on the main thread, and we're going to print the thread values again. And we should see that we're on thread ID 1 and that all of the same original culture information, claims principles, etc. from thread 1 are currently restored. So let's go ahead and let this method run. And perfect. We see that we're back on thread 1. We still have our Spanish Spain culture, our claims principle, and our initial value here in the console. Okay, now we're going to use async await. So instead of saying new thread, instead of saying thread.start, thread.join, instead of doing that crazy stuff, we're going to be good C# developers. We're going to use async await to call task.run. And just by using async await, our execution context is flowed to this new thread. So what we should see now is that we're on a different thread, but those values are preserved. So let's let this run and let's look at our console again. Now let's let it run. There we go. Okay, so we scroll up to where we are in the code and we see here that this is just printing values, but inside of task.run. So we know we're on a different thread than the main thread, but thanks to async await, the execution context has flowed to this new thread and all of our original information about our culture, our principal, and our async local data is still here, even though we're now on a different thread. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to suppress the flow of the execution context. So by calling execution context.suppressFlow, this tells the .NET runtime that, hey, even though I'm using async await, don't flow through these values anymore. Keep that execution context back here on this original thread, and don't automatically flow it through for me. And so that means now we're inside of task.run. So we're inside of a background thread. We can see here that we've already printed to the console the print values from task.run with execution context suppressed line. And now, because we did not pass along the execution context, because we suppressed its flow, these values are going to be totally different. These values should now be the default values that exist on my computer. So let's, for the last time, print the thread values and look at that. We see we're on a background thread, thread 5, but now the culture is English United States, which is the culture that my computer's operating system is using. So even though I didn't set this, this is my default culture. And we see that principal is null, and so is async local data, because we never assigned those values here inside of task.run after suppressing the execution context flow. Now, this is the last line, so let's scroll back up to the top and just walk through again what we did and what we saw, and hopefully what we learned. So we first changed these values on the current execution context for current culture, current principal, async local data. And what we saw is that as long as we use async await, like down here, we used async await, the execution context flowed through to this new background thread. But if we're not using async await and manually spinning up threads, which again, nowadays we should never create our own threads unless we're doing some real level programming. We should always be using async await. This is purely for the example. But what it demonstrates is that if we spin up a new background thread, we can change the culture, we can change the principal, we can change any async local data that's specific to that thread, but we can always bring back in the execution context. So if we ever want this code to run on our original execution context, we can always capture it. We can call execution context.run and essentially restore that information by now flowing through the execution context to this background thread. And then what we saw was as long as we use async await, the execution context flows through for us automatically. Happy days. This is the scenario we should all be doing in our code. But for one more crazy example, which again, you'll probably never write this code, but what it demonstrates is that we can suppress the automatic flow of the execution context that async await uses by calling execution context.flow. And what we noticed and learned in this final task.run, where we're lastly running on a background thread, was that the execution context did not flow through to it. And we did not see the values for current principal, current culture that we set earlier, because this thread has no idea what those values are because we did not flow the execution context to it. Now let's jump into the next video where we discuss the synchronization context.